What in the fuck are you doing in here?
Strange. I could be asking you the same question. I thought this was Leon's house.
Bitch, I live here.
Okay, that really eliminates every follow-up question I had after that. Oh, hey, Julius. This is Miss Valentine. I picked her up from the side of the road near our house when she was unconscious in the snow. I don't know how, but you saying that makes it sound worse.
Okay, great. That only explains the story as to how you got in the house. Doesn't explain why the fuck you're here, though.
Look, Julius, I feel like I'm sensing a bit of hostility coming from you towards me, and frankly, I don't know why.
It's because you're a vampire.
Up. We are not saying that word in front of our little Belmont over here. Because for you see, I plan to be on my best behavior whilst I'm here and can get on my feet enough so I can get back to my castle. If at any point you reveal to him that I am actually what you were about to say I am, I'm going to make sure that any information I have about you gets onto the press. And frankly, I don't know about you, but in the 21st century, that can be very damning.
Oh, please. What information could you possibly even have?
Oh, please, Julius, you do not want to test me. I am the queen of Belmont blackmail. I have one thing about each and every single one of your ancestors. Except for Leon, he is strangely clean. Hello! God, his innocence is creeping me out.
Alright, fine. I'll let you live here, but so as long as you live under my rules and my rules alone. I don't need you causing any trouble around me or my family.
Oh, please, Julius, I have quite the reputation. It's not like I'm going to be doing anything out of the ordinary.
And you see, that's the part right there that fucking scares me. You're a you-know-what. I can't have you doing things that will either incriminate you for being a you-know-what, or just being a you-know-what.
Alright, fine, Julius Belmont. Let's shake on this. You do not say exactly what I am to any of the ancestors of the Belmont Hold, and I follow your stupid rules. Does that sound like a deal?
I hate doing this, but sure, fine. It's a deal.
Splendid. Now we get to know each other without having metaphorical daggers near each other's throats. Greetings, my Cherryful Charriots. Today I have a question for all of you. Have you ever thought about making your own castle? Now, your probable answer is that you gave it some thought, but you never really thought too much about it. Well, guess what? Today's video is all about overthinking a minute idea that sounded pretty cool in your head, but now we're gonna execute it in practice. The Castlevania series is known for its iconic castles, and what makes an iconic castle more than its iconic areas. Games like Symphony of the Night had Dracula's entrance, the Alchemy Laboratory, the Marble Corridor, while other games like Portrait Ruin had its iconic entrance and the Tower of Death. But today's video will be combining all of that into a penultimate castle that I will showcase by the end. But first, allow me to explain. So, in order to create the penultimate castle, we have to follow a few set of rules. The first rule is that we have to use Metroidvania games. That means any game that follows the Symphony of the Night format. So, if it follows that one basic rule, it can be used for this penultimate castle. The second rule, unfortunately, is that it has to be a 2D Metroidvania game. Sorry, Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, but trying to make you into a 2D map is just way more trouble than it's worth. But to compensate for this, by the end of the video I will share my thoughts as to what areas I plan to use for this castle if Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness were taken into account. And yes, Legacy of Darkness and 64 will be included. The third rule is that basically, when we take an area for this penultimate castle, it's not going to be in its original state. What I mean by that is that, you know how if I were to take an area from Harmony of Dissonance, and we all recognize how that game looked, and then put it in this castle, it's going to essentially get a remaster into either the Symphony of the Night style, or the Order of Ecclesia style. which is kind of the two ideals that I had for this castle. What I'm trying to get at here is that it's not going to look the same way it did from its game of origin onto here. So we're going to have to use our imaginations as to figure out how it would look within those styles. Got it? Splendid. Rule number 4. I will be also accounting for bosses within those areas as well. And if an area doesn't have a boss, well, I'm going to give it one. And if you think that the bosses will remain the same, no. In order to keep this interesting, I'm going to mix-mash a few bosses here and there to keep this castle more entertaining. This will also be done to adjust for balancing, as I'm sure you don't want to fight something like Erlanger as soon as you enter the castle. And the final rule that I can think of, I have to at least pick 2 areas from each game that is mentioned. The max I'll put on myself is 5, so then that way we don't get carried away by adding, every fucking area known to man. Instead, we have to be precise and specific as to what areas we want in this castle. I will also explain as to why I chose each area that I did, and I will go in the order at which they came out in. So I will start with Symphony of the Night, and I will end off the entire castle by talking about Order of Ecclesia. I hope all these rules made sense because they all came from the top of my head. And Belmonts tell me I don't have brain power to do meticulous thinking. Oh, final thing before I actually begin. I'm going to try my best to have a story purpose as to why the castle is like this. You'll quickly see throughout the video that I'm going to try and explain reasons as to why each part of the castle from another castle made its way into this castle. And I'll also try to explain geological things about the castle, because you're going to see pretty quickly that, yeah, this castle does not take place on one plane. But with all that being said, let's finally begin. To start things off with Symphony of the Night, I decided to choose 3 areas from that game's castle and port them over to here. Those 3 areas being the Alchemy Laboratory, the Long Library, and the Rainbow Cemetery. The primary reason as to why I chose these 3 areas in specific is because I really like them. Granted, I was going to originally replace Alchemy Laboratory with the Royal Chapel, but I ultimately went against it because there was a pick that would show up later that would conflict with the Royal Chapel, and frankly, I didn't want 2 areas to be of the same kind. So, I decided to ultimately scrap putting the Royal Chapel, and decided to put the Alchemy Laboratory. I say that, but I'm gonna contradict myself later, but you know what, whatever. As for their placements, I decided to put the Alchemy Laboratory near the center of the west wing of the castle. Kind of near the top, though. As for the Long Library, I decided to put it near the center of the castle. Not because I believe that the Long Library is the center of attention, but more so because I needed an area to connect 2 different areas, and the Long Library just so happens to have fit perfectly within that area. So, there it is. Then the Rainbow Cemetery is at the very bottom of the castle, nearly contending with another area that I plan to get to at the very end of the list. So, the reason why it's down there is because frankly, I really had nowhere else to put it. It's either I put it near another area that I'll discuss later, or I put it at one of the other ends of the castle, and frankly, as you can see, I ended up putting it at the other end. By far, I can only say that I'm not too content with Rainbow Cemetery's placement, but honestly, that's what happens when you have an entrance that is only a literal block tall, so really, I worked with what I had. Now, for the bosses of the areas. For the Alchemy Laboratory, I decided to go with Beelzebub being the boss for this area. More so because Slograngabon are very basic, and frankly, I wanted a cool boss to represent the area, so there you go, Beelzebub's the boss for the area. Then for the Long Library, usually the Lesser Demon is the boss of the area, as for the inverted version of the Long Library doesn't even have a boss, so I instead decided to replace it with a boss from Symphony that isn't even in the area at all. That boss being, of course, Malthus. Or Kuramasu, if you're a fucking weeb. To end this off, the boss for the Rainbow Cemetery is going to be Galamoth. I do have to apologize, Legion fans, but I'm not going to put a literal ball as the fucking boss. Especially when my alternative is a cool Egyptian god who shoots thunder out of a rod. So yeah, I believe I made my point. Anyway, with all those areas settled, I think we can move on to the next game that needs representation. You know what? I take back what I said when a game needs representation. Circle of the Moon should not get representation in this castle. And yet, I was kind enough to give it some. So, to my utter begrudgment, I decided to give Circle of the Moon 2 areas. The first area being the Catacombs. You know, the area that has the song Awake playing the entire time. And the other area I chose to give it was the Observation Keep. Initially, I was going to give Circle of the Moon the Machine Tower and the Audience Room. However, I chose to reevaluate my choices and decided, what would be less bad? And I ended up with those 2 picks. Granted, you'll probably see on the map that it's actually a combination of a few areas from Circle of the Moon. So, for example, the Observation Keep is kind of mixed with the Outer Wall, and parts of the Catacombs are mixed with the Ceremonial Room. And this was done majorly because I didn't want the map to look a little funky, so there you go. Now, as for bosses, for the Observation Keep, I'm going to keep the boss the same, as I'm just gonna write in the lore that it's just a duplicate of Hugh instead of actually Hugh. So in other words, you're fighting a doppelganger. As for the Catacombs, I decided to change the boss from Cerberus to literally anything else. And that anything else ended up being the Necromancer. So congratulations, you now get a second chance at life. Now that I think I've practically spoken on everything that I could possibly speak on when it comes to Circle of the Moon, I'm going to safely move on. Finally, a game I like. Unfortunately though, I didn't give it the preferential treatment that I've given Symphony of the Night already. So, according to my better judgment, I only gave Harmony of Dissonance 2 areas. And they are my all-time favorite areas. The Skeleton Den and the Chapel of Dissonance. The Skeleton Den was put in a spot where it combined the Catacombs area of Circle of the Moon and another area that I'll get to in a while when we get to the DS Trilogy. As for the Chapel of Dissonance, I've chosen to put it in a spot where it combines 3 entrances to basically combine parts of the map together more effectively. Plus, out of all the cathedrals or chapels from the Castlevania games, I believe the Chapel of Dissonance is the best one by far. Of course, if we are discounting the Royal Chapel from Symphony of the Night, and the Monastery from Order of Ecclesia. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. Allow me to list the bosses that will be used for these 2 areas. For the Skeleton Den, the boss of this area is going to be the Legion Corpse. Instead, though, I'm going to try and make it more difficult by combining elements from the Symphony version of Legion, and combining elements that allow for the skeleton in Legion's corpse to essentially attack you upon being hit. So in that way, there's more difficulty to be there. As for the Chapel of Dissonance boss, we're gonna have it as Talos. Now, he's usually supposed to be in the Luminous Caverns, however, I decided to put this special guy in this very special place, where he will be essentially guarding the area, as essentially if you want to progress up into the Master's Keep, which I'll get to later, you would have to go through him. Of course, he's going to be adjusted like Legion's Corpse to be more difficult. That way, it's more challenging for the player, and it's a lot more fun. As I remember distinctly, a complaint about Harmony of Dissonance's bosses is that they all can be blown away like they were packs of wheat. So, we are doing this, so then that way that complaint can be addressed and can be fixed. Anyway, let's move on to the next game. We are now at the final game of the GBA trilogy, that being with Aria of Sorrow. And unfortunately, it's kind of anticlimactic, as the areas I chose for Aria of Sorrow were just merely 2, that being the Castle Corridor and the Dance Hall. Meaning that, out of all the Aria representation, it's just bundled up together in the beginning of the castle. And the reason why is, upon later noticing when I was making the castle, I realized that we didn't have any dance halls. And I hadn't used any from Aria of Sorrow, so yeah, that's kinda why it's here. I mean, don't get me wrong, the dance hall was not my first choice by any means. In fact, the original Aria duo was going to be the Castle Corridor and the Arena. However, after some fluctuating of ideas, I eventually ended up with the Dance Hall, begrudgingly. So, allow me to explain why I chose Castle Corridor. It's because I believe, other than Symphony of the Night's entrance, it's probably the most iconic entrance that you can probably think of. Then again, subjectively, I will say that it's Harmony of Dissonance, but enough of my harmony glazing. The boss for the Castle Corridor is going to be the same as it was in Aria, being the Creaking Skull. And the same goes for the Dance Hall, meaning that the boss for that area is going to be Big Golem. Believe me, originally I wanted to put either like Julius or Graham there, but it wouldn't make any sense if I did, so I just chose to keep the bosses the same. Out of all the Castlevania games to be represented on this ultimate castle map, I'd say Aria's is the most underwhelming, but that's more so because all you get is the entrance level of the game and, what, a dance hall. But, nonetheless, I tried to conform with my rules, and this is what my rules dictate. So, without further ado, let's move on into the DS trilogy. We arrive to the wonderful world of Dawn of Sorrow. And for Dawn of Sorrow specifically, I decided to choose the best areas that came from that game. And, I kinda cheated for this? Okay, allow me to explain. Technically, there are 2 areas, but realistically there are 3. Those 3 are the Condemned Tower, the Cave of Judgment, and the Wizardry Lab. I kinda did some shenanifuckery with the Wizardry Lab, as in that game, it was the same area, but they were separated due to the fact that it had like an underwater area. So I had to figure out a way to combine those 2 areas without it not making any sense. So, with what I was able to come up with, satisfyingly, this is what the Wizardry Lab now looks like. You may barf now. Anyway, the other area we have to address is the Condemned Tower and the Cave of Judgment. Originally, I was going to have just the Condemned Tower, but upon putting together different areas next to it, it just felt very weird. So I ended up just putting it alongside the Cave of Judgment and just calling it the Condemned Tower of Judgment. Which I'll give it this, it is a cool ass fucking name. However, doing so has resulted in one problem. Do I put 1 boss or 2 for this area? As, according to my map, it is just meant to be 1 area. But, due to the fact that this 1 area originally had 2 bosses, I'm now kind of stuck as to what exactly I'm supposed to do. And so, I decided to come up with this. I'm only gonna add 1 boss, and enhance the other boss that I already had planned for this area. But before I get into that, let's talk about what the boss for the Wizardry Lab is gonna be. So, like in Dawn of Sorrow, Balor was the boss for this area. However, I'm kind of in a rock between a hard place trying to figure out which Balor I want to put in this area. The one that was from Aria of Sorrow that was actually fucking cool, or the Balor from Dawn of Sorrow that was cool in only appearance. But then I realized, I can simply just put the Balor boss fight from Grimoire of Souls. And you may argue that's technically cheating, but I said that I can only pick areas from the 2D Metroidvania games. I never said that I couldn't pull bosses out of my ass. And so that's exactly what we're doing. So this version of Balor is going to be very identical to the one seen in Grimoire of Souls. Now, as for the Condemned Tower of Judgment, the boss of this area is going to be Gurgoth, because of course it is. However, instead of just falling to the bottom of the Condemned Tower, you are going to be falling all the way from the top of the Condemned Tower to the very bottom of the Cave of Judgment. Just for perspective, the area you're going to be landing when Gurgoth does his jump move is going to be the area that is literally outside of where you would have fought death in Dawn of Sorrow. That is how far you are going to be taking a plunge for. Now, I think that this has the potential to be the coolest fucking fight in this entire hypothetical game. However, like most of what I've just said up till now, it is purely speculative and hypothetical. So I would like to hear your opinions on this matter. Should I just keep it at the regular length like it was in Dawn of Sorrow? Or do we go with my proposed idea, where we drag that motherfucker all the way down to the bottom? Anyway, out of all the games, I'm pretty content with Dawn of Sorrows. Let's move on to Portrait of Ruin. Alright, I'm also technically cheating again with this one, but whatever, allow me to explain. So, for Portrait of Ruin, I also did the same thing that I did for Dawn of Sorrow. Instead, it's a little more complicated than that. So, you know how in Portrait of Ruin, most of the areas that you go to are in paintings? Well, I decided to combine an area from Dracula's castle, that being the number 1 area I picked, and combine that with the painting that the City of Haze and the 13th Street share. Basically, making those 2 areas one as well. Except the problem now stems from the fact that, as you can clearly see on the map, they are not next to each other. So I'm kind of stumped whether to consider this 3 different areas or just 2. My mind keeps telling me I should do 3, but my heart really wants to say it's 2. So I guess I'm gonna let the comment section figure that one out. But enough with the complexities. Allow me to tell you what the areas I chose were. The first area being the Tower of Death, meaning that one waterfall area that you go to in Portrait of Ruin when you fight death. The other 2 areas I chose were the City of Haze and 13th Street. Conveniently enough though, 13th Street is above the City of Haze, which I find almost kind of hilarious. But don't worry, I'll figure out by the end of it. Anyway, the bosses for each of these areas will kind of remain the same. City of Haze will have Dullahan, and 13th Street will have its werewolf. However, the one problem stems from the Tower of Death, and whether or not I should use that game's death boss fight. And, I kinda don't want to do that. Like, don't get me wrong, Death in Portrait of Ruin isn't all too bad, but I hate his design to Ever-Living Hell. So, I'm just gonna flat out replace it with anything else. And like I did for Symphony of the Night, that anything else ended up being Stella and Loretta. Even though you already fight them in that area to begin with, I decided to move their boss fight from where you originally fought them to Death's boss fight room. You know, because it's more climactic that way. And like I stated earlier about fighting Hugh, you're essentially fighting a doppelganger of Stella and Loretta. So it's like the same fight, except with the knowledge that you're fighting a doppelganger. But with all I need to discuss about Portrait of Ruin, let's wrap this up by talking about Order of Ecclesia. Alright, we finally end up with the finale, Order of Ecclesia. And this is the part where I'm excited to talk about it. Because for, you see, to end everything off, I decided to give Order of Ecclesia 4 areas. Technically 3, but 4. Those 4 being Malek's Labyrinth, the Timeo Mountains, Trista's Pass, and the Forsaken Cloister merged together with the final approach. Now, how do I go on explaining this one? So, for Malek's Labyrinth, the boss will remain the same. As for the Timeo Mountains and Trista's Pass, well, this is gonna be a bit more complicated. And not because I don't have any bosses to fit, it's more so, where the fuck do I put these bosses? And after a lot of deliberation, I finally figured out where I'm gonna place these bosses. And let's say what the bosses are exactly. So, the bosses in question that I chose to represent these 2 areas was none other than Erlanger and the Man-Eater. And the reason why I chose those 2 in specific is because I felt like I wanted to put one of my favorite bosses alongside one that wasn't appreciated all that much. And so, this is what we ended up with. Now, you're probably wondering, where's the Death boss fight and where's the Dracula boss fight? And now, here's the kicker. For, you see, the Death boss fight will be located in this room in the final approach. As for the Dracula boss fight, there technically won't be one, because technically, where you're supposed to fight Dracula in Order of Ecclesia, you're instead going to be fighting all the final bosses that each Metroidvania game has, starting from the easiest all the way to the hardest, which means unfortunately you're probably going to be fighting Dracula's Wraith first. And you're probably gonna end it off with Order of Ecclesia's Dracula. Who knows? I kind of expect this to go the same way you fight the Robot Masters from some of the Mega Man games, where like you kind of choose who you want to fight first. The final room of the final approach is also where all the Castlevania characters reconvene, as you also get to choose which character you choose to fight the bosses. Now isn't that just cool? But yeah, I practically went through every single area that I planned to make in this penultimate castle. I hope all of you seem to understand my reasonings and choices behind some of these, as I kind of went through a whole myriad of areas just to figure out which ones I really wanted. Believe me, this required a lot more thinking than I thought was initially required. Also, if you're wondering how I imagined this castle to look like if you were to look from the outside, I don't know how to describe it, so just look at this picture and I'll practically figure everything out. All I can really tell you is that I kind of envision this castle to have a lot of towers. And if you're wondering what I have for the story of this hypothetical Castlevania of mine, here's how I imagine the story to go. Our story starts with Galamoth trying to wreak havoc upon the space-time continuum. Of course, the Time Watchers are there to stop him, but he of course is too powerful. However, he starts to slip up, and then all the different areas and spaces and times start to merge together into a singular space. Meaning, it's essentially like if you combine the events of Grimoire Souls and Castlevania Judgment. Whereas all of Castlevania history's fighters and heroes end up together, and they now have to go through an ultimate castle that is created by different spaces and different times. Of course, you can choose whoever the fuck you want to go throughout the entire castle, and you can switch whenever you want, just as long as you do that in a warp room or in a save room. As I stated before, Galamoth, who is responsible for this, kinda lost control of his power, so he's kinda just stuck down in the Rainbow Cemetery trying to figure out how to get all his power back. However, unfortunately for him, he's not going to, because now he's not the only person trying to get all that power. Not only are different versions of Dracula trying to obtain that power, but Chaos himself is also trying to obtain it as well. So now it's up to the Belmonts, the Morrises, the Lacards, and everyone in between to try and stop all these evils from arising from all different points in time. Defeat all the villains past and restore time and space back to its normal self, and every hero goes back to their respective time. And the universe of Castlevania is preserved. And bada bing bada boom, that is the story that I plan to give to you, and the reason why this castle exists. If you guys have your own castle you would like to share with me, or story that you would like to share with me as well, feel free to do so in the comment section. And believe me, I will read every single word of it, because I, personally, like to read. So, the longer, the better it is for me. Believe me, I'm not one of those too long didn't read types. This video probably isn't as long as my other videos, but I guess we'll see in the editing cycle. But, my name is Cereza Valentine, and I hope all of you enjoyed what was essentially an overglorified shower thought. So, Julius, impressed?
What? No. Why the fuck would I be impressed?
Are you kidding me? I spill my guts out about myself to you, and all I get is, no? Dear Chaos, you Belmonts are so bloody picky!
What the hell do you want me to tell you? It's not like I would be friends with you. Besides, I literally threatened Soma that if he were to become a vampire, I'd fucking kill him. And guess what? Although I didn't have to do that in my timeline, thank fucking Christ, I guarantee you in another timeline I lived up to that promise.
Oh yeah, whatever, Julius. Just tell me next time that you have a stick up your bum. Guys, I may not know why you guys are fighting specifically, but I think I understand that if you guys were to communicate a lot more, and understand each other's grievances, I think that the both of you can have a resounding relationship.
We are not friends!
Huh. When Sarah does that, that usually works. Well, time to go back to the drawing board.
Oh look, now you fucking scared him.
Oh no, yeah, I'm the one who scared him, not Mr. Heart of fucking Fire! So I ended up telling her that she had dreamt up the entire thing. It was a means of protecting her from the truth. Ha ha ha! Although you lied to your betrothed about the events of what happened,
I can understand why you did so, as it was better to protect her from the truth. Did a bad thing for a good cause. From one Belmont to another, I salute you.
Merci, Trevor. It's nice to know.
Julius!
What on earth are you doing? And whom is this?
Oh, fuck.
Sacre Rouge!